So this video is not about Milo Winter, at least not exclusively, but it does begin with a comment we got on our Age of Scorpius video a couple of days ago. In case you're more of a listen to the YouTube video instead of watch the YouTube video sort of club member, and don't worry, that's me too, here is what the commenter, who I'll call S, says in an abridged form. Coming to this late, but I so appreciate this analysis and the time you took to really deep dive. I've been following this because I somehow have the feeling this whole drama, not just the book, has something crucial to say about the moment that we live in. After listening to you, the most prevalent feeling is sadness. It's clear that Milo has a lot to say, a lot of feelings, and some really interesting ideas. And I find it so sad that there was no one he could talk to, no one to guide him like you do in this podcast, maybe someone to counsel a bit of patience. No one should feel like their whole career is over and done with at fucking 22. And as it happens, I completely agree. I think that the novel itself has a lot to teach us about writers, but for the non-writers among us, and their name is Legion for they are many, I think that it might be the drama that's a little bit more interesting, potentially a little bit more immediately relevant. As I said in my previous video on Milo Winter, which analyzed his poetry collection Alterlife, I'm not here to rehash stories of bad behavior that you've likely heard told before and probably told better. Our time is all too valuable for that. Instead, I would like to think of this video as an autopsy of some of the phenomena that made the Age of Scorpius situation as messy as it was. Fair warning, we are going to go very, very far afield of Milo in this little exploration. Our journey is going to take us all the way to the Reconstruction era South. It's going to go into my personal past, and most importantly, to a mythical, nameless valley where dwells an elder god called Hastur. It may sound improbable, but I had a lot of fun charting this path out for us, so I hope you'll come along for the ride. At some point in the past, I don't remember when, someone, I don't remember who, told me, Jay, I think you would really like this collection called The King in Yellow. For those not in the know, The King in Yellow is a short story collection from 1895. It contains 10 stories, but the most important 5 are these existential, really unsettling stories about a play called The King in Yellow that causes bad things to happen to anyone who reads it, usually including insanity and eventual death. The King in Yellow himself, a character from the play, may or may not be real in the stories that feature him, but he's such a beautifully open-ended symbol that writers across time periods have continued to reinterpret him as all kinds of existential concerns, from fascism to alcoholism to personal betrayal. Anyway, I don't really know how I first heard about the book, but it had been on my mind for a really long time. It genuinely might as well have been the king himself telling me in a dream to read it for all the difference it makes. Years later, I was wandering alone around this mountain town. It was autumn, and the thought of the book just kind of came to me, so I popped into the nearest bookstore and I bought the cheapest copy. Within the next couple of days, I had read the first 7 stories, and I thought to myself, wow, these kind of suck, and I love them. The love part, though, applies, ironically, only to the stories with horror elements. As I said in my video on the repair of reputations, I still do not gaffe about the romances in the collection, although one other booktuber has argued pretty convincingly that they do matter thematically for the whole collection. His video will come up later, and I'll also link it in the description below. But anyway, having realized that these stories are really not all that good, I immediately began envisioning a series of short videos breaking down, as I said, again in my first video on the repair of reputations, these stories as short stories, not as capital C classics with all the armor of legacy and entrenched authority that word implies, but really as individual short stories, small works of fiction that have characters who grow and change, though not necessarily always for the better, with plots that build up and release tension and ultimately rhetorical aims, the desire to communicate real human experiences to real human readers. This was, I think, where I actually went wrong. I mean, maybe not like wrong. I do think my videos on the repair of reputation and the mask, which suffered the most from the problem I'm about to describe, are fine. They're all right. But they do have problems. See, when I noticed that there weren't a lot of videos giving really detailed coverage of The King in Yellow here on YouTube, I got really fixated on our channel, SBU English Club, being the place that people could come for more than just summaries of the stories. Here, I thought we could have that, sure, because everybody who's being introduced to them for the first time would probably appreciate a summary, but also some literary analysis, and most importantly, some good old down-home workshopping, where we take a look at which elements of these stories are working and why, and which ones aren't working and why not. Because frankly, and I know that this upsets people every time I say it, but with the exception of the first story, The Repair of Reputations, none of the stories in The King in Yellow that I have read are really that good. I love them, but they are all fucking messy. And I love them because they are messy. I love that they are so close to being there, but are just not right. It makes them the perfect stories to talk about on a workshop-focused channel like this one. But I got so fixated on creating this resource that was not just educational, but also a little bit maybe parasocial, and also contributed to the work here on BookTube that Andrew and I are trying to do by keeping the conversation, about literature rather than about individuals who cause drama, that I failed to do it. I failed to do the thing. I was so excited thinking about doing the thing that itself got in the way of actually doing it. Really, the main thing I could have done better was research the context in which Chambers, the author of The King in Yellow, was writing. If I had looked just a little bit more into Chambers' relationship to the French decadence movement, I would have better understood why Chambers' protagonists, these characters who usually end up reading The King in Yellow and suffering the consequences, were often misanthropic, for example, or idle, and sometimes even downright abrasive. I wanted to read the stories, as I said in my inaugural episode, as stories. But what I've come to learn is something that I actually thought I already knew, that you just can't help a story be a better version of itself if you don't have at least some idea of what the author's actual goal was. And when the author is separated from you, the critic, by over a century, you're likely to have a hard time figuring out what those goals were by reading only the story itself. This was, again, stuff that I thought I already knew, but when time came to put it into practice, I stumbled. It's funny how that works, right? You can think you know something, you can repeat the right ideas, and still have to actually learn the lesson, because when the time comes for you to be tested on it, basically, you don't know as well as you thought you did. And I'm sure you're starting to see some of the parallels that I'm making here, right? Milo said the right phrases. He could tell you all about his 10,000 hours of writing experience. He could tell you about the time he spent world building. He could tell you about all of the agents he had been in correspondence with. He could tell you about teasing out these nuanced character dynamics and imbuing his novel with a message about what it's like to be autistic in a society that doesn't really care to understand and sometimes even works against understanding what it's like to be you as an autistic person. But reading the novel, it isn't distinguishable from a first draft written in just 100 hours, nor do the characters feel like they have much going on in their little heads, nor do the autistic quote-unquote themes do anything more than really just clash with other elements of the narrative. Basically, Milo and I both got ahead of ourselves, and our work suffered for it. His a bit more than mine, I would argue, but still, the core problem is the same. In defense of myself and of Milo, I think that he and I, both trans, young, or new adults eager to participate in an online literary space, suffered from similar issues. Both of us, again, are fairly young, we're fairly inexperienced writers and thinkers growing up in this odd literary environment that has never moved as fast as it is moving right now, and has never fetishized what is new and on trend as much as it does right now. But both of us also did have precedents. Our situation is not, entirely unique. Milo undoubtedly saw how characters like, say, Alex Astor rose to fame and wealth and at least some amount of literary respect after marketing not Lightlark the book, but rather Lightlark the idea to great success on platforms like TikTok. Likewise, my more fumbling early video essays were presaged by a process of partial translation that has always sort of defined how the King in Yellow as a concept has moved through culture. Robert W. Chambers borrowed concepts from Civil War era writer Ambrose Bierce, more on him in just a moment, and H.P. Lovecraft and his student August Derleth borrowed concepts from Chambers, both of them at times taking symbols and characters from the King in Yellow and repurposing them just entirely, so that they really bear only the vaguest resemblance to the quote-unquote original things. And this is where the dissolution of Chambers' King in Yellow seems really to have begun in earnest. Because August Derleth's work inspired a billion sci-fi writers and TTRPG designers to take names like Hastur and then work them into yet new narrative contexts, we were then at least 2 degrees, if not more, separated from what Chambers was trying to do with his original short story collection. The King lost a lot over the years. For example, the context of the decadence and romantic movements that Chambers was kind of operating in. But he's also gained a little bit, to be fair. I mean, like tentacles, and tentacles are cool. We like tentacles, right? So, what context was I missing in my original videos on The King in Yellow? Well, in Kenneth Haight's annotated edition of The King in Yellow, he argues that Chambers' original horror stories were a response to, and even like a repudiation of, the decadence movement that Chambers would have witnessed and maybe taken part in as an art student in Paris in the 1880s. In brief, the decadence movement was a sort of artistic, philosophical movement type of thing that sought to find the beautiful in the traditionally profane and to encourage hedonistic indulgence in all of the pleasures of the flesh, especially sex and drugs. And it was frequently associated with the color yellow. It was itself a response to Romanticism, whose predominant color was this more muted blue, for what it's worth. What matters right now, though, is that Chambers himself was certainly a romantic with a capital R. He believed in true love, that the beautiful and the ontologically good tended to overlap, and that the best pleasures in life were more traditional ones, spending time outdoors, engaging in sports, that kind of thing. It isn't really very hard, then, to see why Chambers chose to make many of his protagonists in the King in Yellow decadence who were punished for reading the accursed Yellow Book. As PhD&D points out in his really excellent video, Hildred Castaigne is a decadent in the sense that after reading the play, he no longer enjoys outdoor activities. Instead, he spends all of his time inside, admiring himself in the mirror with this fake crown on that he imagines is real. Alec, the protagonist of The Mask, smokes too much. He doesn't work very hard at his painting, the reason that he is, conceivably in Paris to paint. And he nearly loses everything when he comes in contact with the play. Boom. See how easy that was? I mean, just a tiny bit of reading would have hugely improved my first 2 videos, and would have helped me to better understand why Chambers' stories, despite their flaws, are nonetheless, I would say, far more resonant than much of the work that they have gone on to inspire. While his original entries into the Yellow mythos certainly want to entertain, as many later ones would go on to do, they are also responses to his real lived experience and to large philosophical concepts that he, the real person, was actually grappling with. Like me, Milo was missing a bit of reading. People have speculated that he doesn't read much fiction, and as much as I wish that I could disagree with that, having read Age of Scorpius, it really does kind of feel that way. The way the Scorpios in his world are oppressed pretty clearly mirrors the way Divergents are treated in Divergent, but that butts up pretty damn hard against this more quest-like structure that the plot seems to want to follow, which reads like a half-remembered retelling of The Hobbit or something. I think that Milo is a very shallow reader, both in the sense that he is selecting only some of the most common texts to draw upon as inspiration, and that he doesn't really understand details of the text that he is reading. For instance, that the totalitarian control that he wants to draw from Divergent doesn't really mesh well with a story where the characters are meandering throughout the land, having all kinds of little one-off combat encounters that are occasionally a bit more dire, but often involve things like, whoa, we're jumping off of a waterfall now, ah! Like, that just doesn't really work with a totalitarian government. What kind of totalitarian government lets a bunch of teenagers wander around the countryside on a quest to get a sword to begin with? It just doesn't seem very likely to happen. So we have Milo seemingly not really understanding the finer points of the texts that he appears to be drawing upon. We have the choice of texts that he seems to be drawing upon being very bland. I mean, no offense to Divergent, well, some offense to Divergent, but certainly no offense to The Hobbit. It's a very, very inspirational, a seminal work, you could say, for a very good reason. But on a really meta level, Milo doesn't seem to have learned anything from what he has read, or maybe he hasn't read enough to have learned things that would be actually useful to him as a human person. As I'm sure Milo would tell you that he knows, the stories we call fiction are quite far from fictional. They are narrativized records of human experience, which means that we can actually learn things useful to us in our real lives if we read the right stories and if we read them well. If Age of Scorpius had been good, it might have actually taught us as readers something about, I don't know, sapphic relationships or what it's like to be autistic in current year. We could have finished the book and then gone out into the world better prepared to relate with and connect to people who are maybe unlike us, but with whom we share this society thing that we seem to be trying to do. Today, I would like to take a look at a story from the Yellow mythos that I think Milo could really, really have learned something from. This story is called Haita the Shepherd, and it's by Ambrose Bierce. As I mentioned earlier, this story predates The King in Yellow by a couple of years, and it was one that Chambers himself actually drew upon as inspiration. So follow me now, if you would, to the Shrine of Hastur. To use, like, MFA language, Haita the Shepherd situates itself narratively in a generic mythic landscape. Or in more normal language, Haita the Shepherd is set in this sort of vague Greco-Roman, maybe Nazarene, if you can use that word that way, Levantine, ancient place. The main character, a young shepherd named Haita, lives alone in a cave between these two mountains. A river runs through the valley in the direction of this unnamed city, and elsewhere in the valley is the home of this holy hermit guy who is like a sort of grandfather figure to Haita. Haita worships the god Hastur, who is the god of shepherds. And you might be wondering why Haita is a shepherd, right? Like, why would he live alone in this cave really far from a city if he's not doing anything with the sheep, right? He's not, I don't know, knitting their wool into novelty sweaters. He's not selling their mutton at market. He's not doing some kind of eugenics simulator in order to breed a bunch of sheep that have both gale force and life taker so that you can, like, sweep madness difficulty. None of that. He just has the sheep. Seemingly, though, Haita is a shepherd because it was just ordained by this god, Hastur. He was given this purpose to be a shepherd, and so he just is. It's part of the natural order, basically. Although that may sound maybe a bit patriarchal or something, Haita and Hastur have like a pretty decent relationship. Haita brings Hastur offerings, and in exchange, Hastur will answer Haita's prayers. For example, to keep the sheep safe from dangerous wildlife, and on one occasion, even to stop a flood that is threatening to destroy the city. On the other hand, Hastur is pretty emotionally distant, and he never reveals himself to Haita physically or even visually. So let's pause now, sort of at the cusp of the inciting incident, to take stock of what is going on in this story thematically. Haita is a kind of like fusion of Jesus Christ and Adam Genesis. Like Jesus, Haita is a shepherd, right? And he works miracles of a sort, by calling on Haita to intercede in everyday affairs. He's also best friends with a holy hermit, just like Jesus was best friends with John the Baptist. And finally, Haita he's innocent and naive, like Adam before the fall. In being almost like a kind of split difference between these two mythological characters, Haita is sort of like your stock person of faith. He's average, but he's also special in the sense that he has been chosen, seemingly at random, but maybe not, to do something extraordinary by being a personal attendant of this god. He's like, say, your average burgeoning writer who happens to have been selected by great, even incomprehensible forces to be at the center of the book world this month. He could be you, or he could be me, but he isn't either of us. He's someone else we both know, if you sort of get my drift. Meanwhile, Hastur is a little bit like the Christian god, right? He's there, but he's not there. He seems to be uniquely powerful among the gods in that he can stop a flood that's being caused by a different deity. So although this story might, like I said earlier, sound like a little Greco-Roman or something like that, I would argue that it's predominantly dealing with more contemporary faiths, at least on like a thematic level. Okay, so the inciting incident, what, disrupts this stable status quo? And to that question, I answer another question. What disrupts the idyll of the first act of any coming-of-age story, right? A loss of innocence. So for reasons that aren't explicitly stated and that probably aren't any more complicated than just like Haita growing up, he begins to wonder why, like all of his sheep, at a certain point, they slow down, they stop moving, they start to rot. In brief, he becomes aware of death, and that causes him to wonder what the implications are for him and, like, his bodily existence. "It is necessary," he said, "that I know whence and how I came, for how can one perform his duties unless able to judge what they are by the way in which he was entrusted with them? And what contentment can I have when I know not how long it is going to last? Perhaps before another sun I may be changed. And then what will become of the sheep? What, indeed, will have become of me?" Haita is concerned with at least two things here. First of all, his purpose. How can he know what it is to be a shepherd if he doesn't know why, he specifically was chosen to do it? Second, he wants to understand the relationship between happiness and the future. How can I be happy, he wonders, if whatever happiness I do end up having could always be taken away in an instant? A pretty basic question, sure, but give him a little bit of a break. He's young, his life has been one of relative privilege and comfort under the watch of this very powerful god, and he never thought something this scary would come upon him this quickly. Thinking about death, Haita becomes depressed. He stops taking care of his flock, he loses interest in other hobbies that he had, like playing the flute, and he eventually stops worshipping Hastur altogether. He says, "I will no longer be a suppliant for knowledge which the gods withhold. Let them look to it that they do me no wrong. I will do my duty as best I can, and if I err, upon their own heads be it." In other words, Hastur knows the answers to the questions that I, Haita, am dealing with right now. So if I make any mistakes out of ignorance, it's really kind of the gods' fault too for not sharing the answers with me. And I honestly think that that's pretty damn sound logic. This is the part where I think Haita's story kind of stops cleanly mirroring Milo's online literary story, and where Haita's story could begin to be instructive to Milo, as it was instructive to me. The next thing that happens is basically this. And that's not even really a joke. A beautiful woman enters Haita's cave out of nowhere and offers to be his companion. Haita bows down to her, but she tells him to stop because she's like, no, you misunderstand. I'm not any kind of goddess. Haita understandably begins asking a shit ton of questions, but in response, the woman makes this scary, sinister shushing motion and starts to back away from him. And then this happens. Her beauty underwent a visible alteration that made him shudder. He knew not why, for she was still beautiful. The landscape was darkened by a giant shadow sweeping across the valley with the speed of a vulture. In the obscurity, The maiden's figure grew dim and indistinct, and her voice seemed to come from a distance as she said, in a tone of sorrowful reproach, "Presumptuous and ungrateful youth, must I then so soon leave thee? Would nothing do but thou must at once break the eternal compact?" Inexpressibly grieved, Haita fell upon his knees and implored her to remain, rose and sought her in the deepening darkness, ran in circles calling to her aloud, but all in vain. She was no longer visible, but out of the gloom he heard her voice saying, "Nay, thou shalt not have me by seeking. Go to thy duty, faithless shepherd, or we shall never meet again." So she leaves, and Haita notices that outside his flock is suddenly under attack by like a shit ton of wolves. So he fights them all off, and in doing so, he feels a sense of purpose be restored to him. He then goes and prays to Hastur for the first time in kind of a long while. The next day then, the woman actually comes back, and she explains that she returned because he did his duty, A, by saving the sheep, and B, by praying to Hastur. Haita once again asks her to stay forever, but his request makes her disappear for a second time, this time less horrifyingly. But once again, as soon as she's gone, disaster strikes. Haita notices outside a flood is gathering again in the lower parts of the valley, so he prepares to take his sheep into higher pastures, which he does, saving them. It's then a really long time that passes before the woman comes back for the third and final time. One day, Haita is coming back from a visit to the holy hermit, who's getting older. He's getting to the point where he can't really take care of himself, so Haita has been bringing him like food and milk and stuff like that. The woman meets Haita on the road home, and she says that she has once again come to move in with Haita. As with the previous two times, Haita gets down on his knees and he promises to do or not do anything that she does or doesn't want him to do as long as she will just fucking stay. Of course, the woman vanishes again, but this time Haita is kind of just like, okay, what the fuck? So he goes back to the holy hermit to see if that guy knows anything about this lady and like what's going on. And brace yourselves, because the story does have kind of an r/I'm 14 and this is deep ending, but we got to keep in mind that A, Haita is like 14 probably, and B, this story was written for a very general audience in the 1800s. We will still address and critique some of the weird choices that it makes, but I at least do want to couch our expectations with a little bit of context, in the interest of fairness, if nothing else. So Haita goes back to the hermit, tells him what's been going on with this lady, and the hermit says, "My son, I have attended to thy story, and I know the maiden. I myself have seen her, as have many. Know then that her name, which she would not even permit thee to inquire, is Happiness. Thou saidst the truth to her, and she is capricious, for she imposeth conditions that man cannot fulfill, and delinquency is punished by desertion. She cometh only when unsought, and will not be questioned. One manifestation of curiosity, one sign of doubt, one expression of misgiving, and she is away. How long didst thou have her at any time before she fled?" "Only a single moment," answered Haita, blushing with shame at the confession. "Each time I drove her away in one moment." "Unfortunate youth," said the holy hermit, "but for thine indiscretion, thou mightst have had her for two." Dialogue is genuinely written like Tig-tone, but we push on. This really is the moral of the story, right? Happiness presents a sort of paradox type of thing. When one does what one was born to do, then one is happy. But if that happiness is examined or questioned, or if more happiness is asked for, then the happiness is going to vanish. You could pretty easily substitute happiness in this story with success. Like happiness, the more one focuses on having arrived at a state of success, the more energy one directs away from actually doing the things that bring the success about. But as I often do, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's slow down. The author of Haita the Shepherd, that Ambrose Bierce guy that I mentioned earlier, is often considered to be a philosophical naturalist, meaning that he believed that phenomena traditionally attributed to the supernatural can be more accurately explained as just a human lack of understanding of some aspect of the natural world. We can see hints of this sort of naturalism in his most famous book, which was the 1906 The Devil's Dictionary, where he defined ghost as the outward and visible sign of an inward fear. This, quote, clarifies his fundamentally psychological approach to the supernatural, according to the Poetry Foundation. We can also see his general distaste for structural, organized religion in poems like the New Decalogue, which is a fancy way of saying the Ten Commandments, which is this sort of satirical poem mocking the Ten Commandments that he observed Christians to actually put into practice. One couplet reads, "Bear not false witness, shake your head, and say that you have heard it said." In other words, if you don't have a reason to believe the thing that you want to believe, just mindlessly repeat a phrase that you think you have maybe heard somewhere before. Defer to someone else's thinking when in doubt. Samuel Loveman, a friend of H.P. Lovecraft and critic whose life overlapped with Bierce's, wrote, "To Bierce, simply and sincerely, diabolism, or things related to the devil, held in its tormented depth a legitimate and reliant means to the end, that is, to achieving horror. Yet a tacit conformation with nature is in every instance insisted upon." In other words, the devil is in everything Bierce writes, but the devil is really a natural thing. The devil is not a supernatural being. Keeping that in mind, it does seem kind of weird, right, that Haita the Shepherd tells us a story where one of the requirements for happiness is dutiful service to a deity, right, to Hastur. After all, it is both tending to his flock and praying that causes the woman to appear for the first time. And she doesn't appear for the third and final time until Haita learns how to master purpose, prayer, and charity. I wish I could have come up with a third P for that, but I couldn't do it in the moment. And it's funnier now if I leave this in. So why would this irreligious guy write a story arguing for the necessity of belief in a god, right? Well, I think that Hastur is really more of a metonym. He's not really about religion, like if we applied this story to the real world. He's actually a substitution for another idea. John R. Brazil, who is this scholar of American studies, notes that Bierce saw the world, and especially the Reconstruction-era South, where he lived most of his life, as a really fallen place, full of just depravity and avarice and ruin. Brazil writes, "Bierce's ultimate objection to Romanticism was based on fear. He was afraid that people would attempt to deal with the, quote, real world on the basis of the, quote, language of Romantic Victorian literature. Its portrayal would infect their political perception. He saw its reality becoming their reality. The problem, obviously, was that it was not reality, and above all else, Bierce was a realist." Romanticism was really like a lot of things, but for our purposes, one thing that Romanticism often did was encourage this conflation of subjective experience with actual reality. For example, a flower that to a romantic was beautiful was not just beautiful in his opinion, it was also beautiful in some kind of like transcendent way, that its beauty was an expression of an ontological, moral goodness. Bierce really feared that readers of Romantic texts would absorb these implicit beliefs about reality, which, to be clear, are not true, and that they would basically be led from reality and into delusion. And Bierce was someone who cared a lot about truth. He really had this almost Ace Attorney-esque fixation with finding and believing the truth, once writing, "No elevated composition has the right to be called great if the message that it delivers is neither true nor just." While I don't hold so dogmatically to Bierce's standard, I do think that what he's saying here has kind of a good point. We should be really, really wary of handing out the crown of calling something like a great or canonical work if it risks guiding us away from the truth and into illusion. I think on that much, he kind of was right. But not all of Bierce's beliefs were even, that agreeable. At one point, Bierce publicly opposed charity, whether private or public, because it, quote, helped the incapables whom nature is trying to weed out. But he then later changed his mind, proposing what Brazil called a, quote, quasi-socialist 6-point program that included such tenets as limiting fortunes by taxation, requiring the states to provide work during hard times, and abolishing wage competition. But then, later, Bierce became critical of socialism, writing that he worried it would weaken America's defenses against, outright anarchy. Brazil continues that Bierce seems to have developed a fear not just of romantic aesthetics, but of, the immensity of the cultural conversation of his day. Bierce seems to have been just overwhelmed by the number of isms, of parties and affiliations, and he began to feel that no one was actually at the helm of human society, as it were, that so many people were vying to exert control over so many spheres of influence, both large and small, that outcomes were completely unguessable, and that the world was, in effect, basically ruled by chaos, even if it appears to be systemic in some way. Back to Brazil, Bierce's nihilistic perception of causality was, of course, reflective of a concomitant ontological confusion. Not knowing why things happened, he could not know what they meant. Not knowing what they meant, he found it impossible to assure himself what they were worth. The volume of his judgments, then, was compensatory, the product of a man who searched ever more frantically for some bedrock reality, some final, permanent, immutable position that would, quote, authenticate art, politics, and civilization. He failed in that search. And yes, that last sentence is implying what it might seem to be implying. Bierce disappeared. We don't actually know how he died, but he seems to have wandered off into Mexico to cover some armed conflict that was going on. And some people suspect that he was not planning to come back from that. Just to pause briefly on something that we can learn from Bierce here, one can be a good writer and still be in the process of refining one's beliefs. Really, writing can be one way in which one's beliefs are honed. I mean, that is one way that I personally use poetry. It teaches me what I really think. In trying to express a concept in this really compressed, really precise format, I am pushed to notice and eliminate gaps in my thinking and feeling to make sure that, my conclusions follow from my premises, all of that kind of stuff. And Milo could have really, really used this in his writing of Age of Scorpius, I think. Just as a very broad example, he could have asked himself, do I really think that the main characters, a bunch of children, finding the Calexis, which is this legendary sword that, if they present it to the public, will in some way allegedly prove that all of history has been manipulated for hundreds of years, do I really think that if the main characters find and present that sword, it is going to create immediate, clear social upheaval? Do I really believe that humans work this way? That they would be so easily convinced to give up long-held social, religious, interpersonal, political doctrines and listen to what these kids have to say? And realizing that the answer to this multi-part, poorly phrased question is fucking no would have been the first step in creating a better world in which a better story could have taken place. But back to Bierce. If Bierce believed writing ought to make every effort to affirm only factual interpretations of reality, but didn't believe in a god himself, why again does he argue that happiness only appears to those who have learned how to worship? And I see two possible sort of explanations here. So first, it's possible that Bierce thought to prostrate oneself before a god was integral to just being human, that even if gods aren't real, we have to act as though they are, because doing so is one way that we maximize our happiness. This would imply that as a realist wanting to achieve happiness himself, Bierce was willing to act in ways against what he actually thought to be true about religion in order to min-max his happiness value. Second, and I think that this is probably the more convincing one, Hastur is, as I said, a stand-in for some kind of organizing force that Brazil is also writing about. Hastur is a god in Haita's world, but when we take him and apply him to our own world, he's more of a general sense of order, a fact that, if uncovered, would, make it all make sense. Hastur often gets conflated nowadays with the King in Yellow himself, as I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos now. We can even see that happening in like this Yu-Gi-Oh card that I bought for myself called Old Entity Hastur, where Hastur is looming in the background and the King in Yellow is very much foregrounded, sort of implying that the King in Yellow is like an avatar of, a part of, a manifestation of this higher being called Hastur. And I think that it could make sense to conflate the two in this case as well, because it really was the King in Yellow that I think Bierce was seeking. He wanted this grand truth that would make him feel totally secure in his existence as an artist, as a political actor, and then ultimately as like a human being, even if uncovering it made him go mad. After all, being called mad is probably not something that would have bothered Bierce, given how he defined the word in his 1906 hit, The Devil's Dictionary. Mad. Affected with a high degree of intellectual independence, not conforming to standards of thought, speech, and action derived by the conformants from the study of themselves, at odds with the majority, in short, unusual. For illustration, this present and illustrious lexicographer is no firmer in the faith of his own sanity than is any inmate of any madhouse in the land. So I do think that Haita the Shepherd succeeds as a story according to Bierce's own metrics, which is good. It's good for a writer to succeed by their own standards. But how are we feeling about it, right? And I have a hard time kind of critiquing this story because it feels like what sort of day I'm having often determines my relationship to it. And honestly, to this type of story more generally. Sometimes I find the simplicity pretty refreshing. This is a story that really strips away all of the bullshit, where Haita, happiness, and Hastur are all one-to-one allegories for very clear real-world concepts, which makes it easy to come away from the story with a sense that Bierce has, communicated something to me. I feel like I have decoded his coded message, I get it, now I get to think about it on my own time. Other times, I find everything just way too archetypal, which was also a criticism that was leveled at Bierce during his own day. Bierce wrote primarily, but not exclusively, for popular audiences, so we can safely assume that the relative simplicity here was a choice and not just an accident or a lack of technical ability. In any case, I think it would be at the very least fair to say that this story is not really making the most out of the techniques that are unique to fiction, or is at least using those techniques with such a blunt efficiency that they do become a little bit inelegant. Haita, for example, he's technically a character, he experiences an inciting incident that changes his relationship to the world. He negotiates those various changes, and then at the end, he arrives a new person. Whether or not this person is in better circumstances than at the beginning of the story is very much debatable, but regardless, some kind of movement has occurred, so that's one box checked. In fact, I would say this checks a lot of boxes. But you could be forgiven, and I do forgive myself as well, for sometimes feeling that the story just isn't really doing a lot to help us feel attached to Haita the guy. One moment I do think is working, though, is the second time that happiness appears, the second, too. This is one of the only moments where Haita, really reveals something of himself as a person. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, that he wishes that happiness were a boy so that he could wrestle and play with her when she, as she is at that moment promising to do, stay forever. Reading this, I'm okay, so Haita he's definitely lonely and is maybe even queer, but then the story doesn't really expand on either of those aspects at all. So this ultimately, regardless of how you read it, feels pretty much like a loose end. There's also something ironically maybe very romantic about this setting that I enjoy. There's these bucolic hills, this distant city never more than half visible on the horizon, and future writers have gone on to interpret this city as Carcosa, although this does contradict the story in which Carcosa actually appears, but whatever. I get the impulse to do that. I do like it too. I also feel that despite having been published in 1891, the language is a lot wordier than it needs to be. Again, I know there is a quote-unquote reason for this. Bierce, again, has us in this mythological setting, and he wants to emphasize that aesthetic by making certain language choices that are especially arch. But when you start describing river gods as, quote, riparian intelligences, something has gone wrong, and no, it is not lost on me that Milo also used that exact same word in his poetry collection, Alter Life. Ultimately, though, it's hard to really offer any suggestions about how to change the things that I don't really fuck with so much, because that would contradict the goal of the text in a way. Any suggestion that the setting be made in some way more specific, or that, I don't know, the Holy Hermit be more than a vending machine for the point of the story, would really muddy the story's rhetorical clarity, which in its current form is probably its greatest strength. For me, this is basically just a story with some self-confidence. Like Freiwald's Field Trip that we read previously, Haita the Shepherd knows that it wants to be a morality tale disguised as commercial supernatural fiction, and while that can leave it feeling stiff and impersonal at times, it also reveals something about Bierce. And y'all know how much I love it when a story tells me something about the real inner world or the real outer world of an actual human person. This is a story by a guy who has lost his faith and become a naturalist, and has fallen into that common post-deconstruction trap of nihilism. Depending on your reading, we must either worship a god that isn't there because it is ineffably good for us as biological beings, or we must find and dedicate everything to truth. Because if we don't, we have really no chance of flourishing. Both options are quite rigid, quite high stakes. There's this truth that I think myself, Milo, and really every creative individual must accept. And I think it would be most useful for people that are on the verge of becoming a Milo-like figure. In a way, it is too late for both me and for him. We've had to learn this lesson to very different degrees, but we have both already had to learn it. But there are people out there, and I hope that this will reach those people, who might be about to become like Milo. And if possible, I would like to talk them down from becoming that, because as much as Haita's ultimate fate, it's debatable whether or not it's better or worse than his starting point, Milo's current position, I would wager, is pretty clearly worse than his starting point. He is worse off now than if he had just waited on Age of Scorpius to begin with, as the commenter at the very beginning of the video was suggesting. But that truth that I think is so useful is basically just this. You don't become a successful writer by wanting to be a successful writer. That doesn't mean you are not allowed to desire success. You are, you may, it might even help you. But the desire itself is not what facilitates that success ultimately coming about. Rather, success is arrived at any number of far more mechanical ways, both legitimate and dubious, unfortunately. Maybe your writing is just so topical that it naturally draws a really broad audience. Maybe you have connections on the inside of academia or the publishing world, or both. Maybe you're a relentless self-promoter. Any of these things could assure your at least initial success as a new writer. But you will never, ever be successful by, as I saw several commenters on my Alter Life video say, wanting to already have been successful, wanting to already have been talked about as though your writing is deep and profound and necessary at this historical moment. You will not. The harder you pursue success itself, success as an ends, rather than the factors that make one successful, the further away you are going to get. Guaranteed. A really unfortunate fact of the nihilism that I've been talking about in this video is that it's super easy to fall into. As much as I like making these King in Yellow videos in particular, there are times where they underperform and it all begins to feel kind of pointless in a way. I depend on these videos for income right now, and it is incredibly frustrating when something I poured myself into just doesn't get really any kind of response at all. And I wouldn't be surprised if Milo is also feeling pretty nihilistic these days. After having, capital S success, the beautiful woman, visit him in his little cave, seemingly in order to change his life for the better, success has now just utterly vanished, right? She is gone. And I know that for some, the nihilism that I've discussed earlier can feel sort of invincible. You might want to defeat it, but it seems impossible. We can throw platitudes at it, maybe. We can insist on the inherent value of sentient life. You hear me slowing down as I get bored even trying to think of what the platitudes might be. But we aren't ever going to have all the answers, right? We will suffer. Our greatest fears may even come to pass. We will die, and probably we will all be subsequently forgotten. Basically, there is no Easter Bunny, there is no Tooth Fairy, and there is no Haster. I don't have a solution to that, and I suspect that anybody who tells you that they do, especially if they're my age, is sub 20 words from trying to sell you something. But one thing I do know is that in order to find the solution to any problem, you first have to be able to imagine the solution existing. Even if you can't imagine what it is, you need to be able to imagine that it could exist. To close, here's a poem by W.H. Auden that I think does a really lovely job of just that. Thank you all for coming to club today, and I'll see you around campus. The More Loving One by W.H. Auden. Looking up at the stars, I know quite well that, for all they care, I can go to hell. But on earth, indifference is the least we have to dread from man or beast. How should we like it were the stars to burn with a passion for us that we could not return? If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. Admirer as I think I am of stars that do not give a damn, I cannot, now I see them, say, I missed one terribly all day. Were all stars to disappear and die, I should learn to look at an empty sky and feel its total dark sublime, though this might take me a little time.